All right, the College Football Playoff Committee has made its selections for a Week 12, and now we get to the games starting on Saturday with Joe Lisi at GoForThe2.com. Let's run them down, Joe. They should be a batch of excellent games here. Let's start in the ACC, and the first time that we've put some attention on this conference for quite a while because Florida State's had a pass for most weeks, but they may get a little bit of a challenge going on the road to Miami. Last year, the Noles and the Canes squared off when they were both undefeated, and the Noles definitely showed that they were the class of that conference, and the Canes not ready for prime time. What do you think this time around between Miami hosting Florida State?
Well, numbers-wise, Mark, Florida State's won 4 straight, so that favors the Seminoles heading into this matchup. But Miami is 2 different teams on the road than they are at home. They're 5-0 at home overall. Last year they were 6-1. This team plays much better at home than it does on the road. When you look at their defense, statistically only giving up 180 passing yards per game, that they match up very well against the Florida State passing attack and Jameis Winston, and they're very solid in run support, only giving up 131 rushing yards per game. But at home, Mark, they're only giving up 55 rushing yards per game. This is a defense that can create turnovers. They're +2 in turnover margin. They have a big play linebacker in Denzel Perryman and a big play safety in Dallas Crawford that could really be game changers on the defensive side of the ball. You look at the offense as well. Duke Johnson's a home run hitter. Miami's averaging 199 rushing yards per game. At home, they're rushing for 235 rushing yards per game. So a different team than they play at home than they do on the road. You look at their quarterback, Brad Kaya, 7 touchdowns, no INTs in the last 3 games. He's really coming along in the system. I think Miami pulls the upset. When you look at Florida State overall, not the same team defensively, in my opinion. They're giving up 237 passing yards per game. They're not creating turnovers. This is a team that is 0 in turnover margin, and they're not getting a lot of sacks. They only have 16 sacks on the year through 9 ball games. This is a team that, in my opinion, it can be exploited by Miami. I think the key for Miami, they have to get Philip Dorsett involved in the offense. You look at his big play ability, 30.1 yards per catch. He has 572 yards already and 6 touchdowns. I expect Brad Kaya to utilize him on play action, and I think Miami gets the upset in a big way on Saturday. I think they're poised. They're coming off a bye week as well. They should be rested and look for Al Golden to pull out all the stops against Jameis Winston and company.
Well, there are some folks in Ohio, some folks in Big 12 country as well that are rooting for you and your prediction right there. There are 2 thoughts of lines of thinking with Florida State. One is that they're playing down to their competition, and when they get hit in the mouth by a good team that they will respond. The other would be that this team is not nearly as good as they were in winning the BCS championship last year. We shall see. I don't know that Miami's the team to do it, but they are the lone remaining decent quality team before the ACC championship game. So as we continue with the teams that factor into the college football playoff or a conference championship, we stay in the ACC because the team that's going to represent the other division opposite Florida State is still very much up in the air. Clemson might be the second best team in the ACC, but of course they've got to be in the division with Louisville and with Florida State. Therefore, Georgia Tech at 5-2 in the conference with a better shot of gaining an ACC championship and upsetting the whole apple cart. You got Clemson, you got Georgia Tech playing in Atlanta.
Georgia Tech playing very well defensively. They're +9 in turnover margin, but a lot of it has come on the road. They're only +1 in turnover margin at home. They're +8 in turnover margin on the road. They create turnovers. A dominant performance against NC State last week. They're rushing the football. But you look at the flip side with Clemson. They're very solid in run support. Clemson matches up very well against Georgia Tech, and they're very solid in the secondary. I expect a dominant victory by Clemson. You look at the last few games. Last year they beat Georgia Tech 55-31. I know Cole Stuff hasn't progressed that well in the system over the last couple of weeks. They've had to sort of grind it out in victories over Louisville and Boston College, but Clemson's playing very well. I expect a dominant Tiger victory on Saturday. I look at the offensive weapons that Clemson still possesses on the outside, and Georgia Tech not that good in the secondary, giving up 240 passing yards per game. I think this matches up very well for Clemson. I expect a dominant Tiger victory on Saturday.
All right, Joe, let's stay in the ACC, where Duke is getting less credit than any one-loss team in college football. They are 8-1. Their non-conference schedule was complete garbage. Kansas, the best quality, I'm not going to use that word, the best opponent that Duke had on its non-conference schedule. They're 4-1 in the ACC. Their win that really propelled them toward an ACC championship game last year, along with Miami, was the Virginia Tech effort. They get the Hokies at home. Duke, again, trying to get back to the ACC championship game at 8-1, and Virginia Tech a disappointing 4-5.
You look at Virginia Tech, they've struggled with teams with speed on the outside. You can look at that Miami game on Thursday night a few weeks ago. You just saw the speed of Miami take over, and Duke Johnson had a big ball game. Duke beat Virginia Tech last year. It was prior to that, Virginia Tech had won 12 straight, but Duke got the victory last year. So I expect Duke to be up for this ball game, and I like Anthony Boone at the quarterback position. The fact that they're playing at home, you've seen them challenge solid defenses in the ACC. They were able to get the victory a few weeks ago over a very solid Virginia club. Virginia Tech is not, in my opinion, the same type of defense that Virginia possesses, and I think Duke pulls out the victory on Saturday. Their only loss all season was a 22-10 defeat on the road in Miami in the rain. That was a tough ball game for Duke to pull that out, and Miami did knock them off. But that is the only blemish on their record this season. They played well on the road and have played well at home, and they have big play wide receivers on the outside that I expect to challenge the Virginia Tech secondary. And in my opinion, Anthony Boone, a very underrated quarterback. I like what he was able to do last week in the Carrier Dome against Syracuse. I think Duke gets the victory on Saturday.
All right, Joe, we got two important games in the Big Ten. Of course, Ohio State coming off that landmark statement win in East Lansing, 8-1 now. The Virginia Tech game seems to be a mile away for the Buckeyes at this point. They go to Minnesota to take on a Gopher team that gets a lot of credit for Jerry Kill and what he has done with marginal talent. They don't throw the ball very well, but Minnesota plays sound, fundamental team football. Otherwise, they come in at 7-2 hosting the Buckeyes.
Well, Ohio State has won 8 straight over Minnesota, but you look at this Minnesota ball club, Mark, they're very sound defensively, especially in the secondary, only giving up about 180 passing yards per game, and they create turnovers. They're +8 in turnover margin, but they do it at home. They're +11 in turnover margin. I like their running backs of Kirkwood and Cobb, a very blue-collar offensive line, and you look at J.T. Barrett and the Buckeyes for what they were able to do, 568 total yards of offense against the #1 defense in the Big Ten in Michigan State. To do that on the road is just an incredible performance by Urban Meyer's club. But there has to be a little bit of an emotional letdown as they travel to Minnesota this weekend on back-to-back road games and a very methodical blue-collar team in Minnesota. I expect Minnesota to push Ohio State to the limit, but in the end, I think Ohio State gets a 3-point victory, but I think it's a very close game in Minnesota this weekend.
Wow, 3-point win for the Buckeyes, much closer than the experts would say, looking at Vegas's line at 12 points. Aside from Mississippi State going to Alabama, this would be the game that I want to see more than any this week. You got the Western Division lead on the line in the Big Ten when you got Nebraska and Wisconsin. Since Nebraska has joined the Big Ten, this is the one school that has really knocked them around, most specifically in the Big Ten championship game a couple years ago. So the Badgers have taken themselves out of it momentarily with a loss to LSU, then Northwestern, but they're back in it at 4-1, and it's pretty much a division up for grabs between these two teams in Minnesota, and this is the first of a round of 3 weeks here that's going to decide the Western Division in the Big Ten. Huskers 8-1 need to prove themselves as a better than expected one-loss team against Wisconsin at 7-2.
You look at what Nebraska is. They have a very blue-collar offensive line that's big and strong and can pound Wisconsin's defensive front. Wisconsin beat up on some defensive teams that were more finesse teams like Rutgers, teams like Purdue, and teams like Maryland. Well, Nebraska's built a little bit differently on both sides of the ball, offensive line and defensive line, and you look at their quarterback, Tommy Armstrong, I think he could create some problems for that Wisconsin defense. Nebraska's supposed to have Amir Abdullah back for this ball game, but I don't think it really matters. I think the game is going to be won on the offense and defensive lines, and I think the advantage, in my opinion, goes to Nebraska. I like their defensive front led by Gregory, and I like the offensive line that's able to wear down defenses late in the game, and I think this is a team that nobody really in the Big Ten is talking about, Nebraska. The only blemish on their record is a 5-point defeat on the road to Michigan State. So this is a team that if they can really beat up Wisconsin this weekend, has to be mentioned with Ohio State at this point as a possible playoff team should they run the table.
I agree with you right there. That's what Big Ten fans are hoping for. One loss Ohio State versus one loss Nebraska in that championship game. Let's head out west to the Pac-12, and we've got Arizona State, who has taken notice that they could be in this thing all the way to the end. They completely annihilated Notre Dame. They got a bit of a scare in the fourth quarter at 34-31, and then they really showed that they can finish a ball game. They are going to Oregon State, Mike Riley's team, not the threat that they typically are at this point, winning 7-8 games a year, usually getting to a decent bowl game at 4-5, just 1-5 in the Pac-12. So we've got Oregon State hosting Arizona State.
Well, first, you have to give credit Todd Graham and Arizona State for what they were able to do against Notre Dame, create 5 turnovers and being able to jump up on Notre Dame 34-3. Just incredible first half performance by Arizona State. They had to hang on in the end, but the speed of Arizona State was the difference, especially in the secondary on the defensive side of the ball. Their ability to create turnovers. They're going to be traveling to Corvallis, which is not an easy place to play, and they're going to be playing a solid Pac-12 quarterback in Sean Mannion. I think this is a tough spot for Arizona State because when you look at their last 3 games, they had a tough road trip a few weeks ago against Washington, pulled that out. They came back home against a very solid blue-collar Utah team, had to win that game in overtime, and then had to play a top 10 matchup with Notre Dame last week. Now have to go on the road. So emotionally, I think it's a very tough spot for Arizona State. I think they have the better talent. I think they win this ball game by about 7 points, but I still think Oregon State poses a problem and pushes them to the limit because of their tough 3-game stretch. And look for Sean Mannion to exploit some of the holes in the Arizona State secondary and look for them to try and run the football, something that Notre Dame didn't do last week because they fell behind early. This Arizona State defense is still giving up about 180 rushing yards per game. That's how you have to beat Arizona State. You have to be able to rush the football. Look for Mike Riley and the Beavers to try and do that early. If they get some early success, could be a lot closer than people think. But in the end, I still think Arizona State pulls out a 7-point victory on Saturday.
Arizona jumped on the map with a win at Oregon and made its way to number 12 in the country. Then they go to UCLA and in the Rose Bowl could only score 7 points against the Bruins. They drop back at 7-2. But if we're looking at simply the Pac-12 and not the college football playoff, Arizona at 4-2, just a game back of Arizona State. And, of course, that's the rivalry game at the end of the year. So they could still get to the Pac-12 championship game by running the table. We get the Wildcats hosting a Washington team that was beat up against UCLA last week.
Well, when you look at Washington overall, their problem is they can't stretch defenses vertically with their quarterback, Siler Miles, still averaging under 200 yards per game in terms of passing offense. That's why Washington has had a 6-4 record overall. They can defensively match up with any team within the Pac-12. They have a solid defensive line that's able to create sacks, and they're solid in run support. But the fact that they're going to be on the road in Tucson, I expect Rich Rod to really challenge that secondary. Really, if Arizona jumps up early in this matchup, I think it's a tough matchup for Washington to come back for. If they can jump up early on the road, then it's a different story. If they can get Arizona into a blue-collar, methodical 16-13 type of game, but I don't see it happening on the road in Tucson. I think Arizona has too many offensive weapons, and I like Solomon at the quarterback position. I just think Arizona has way too much offense for Washington in this game. I think it's about a 14-point Arizona victory at home.
Joe, as we move to the SEC, I don't think any team has changed national perception as much as Texas A&M in the span of 1 week. Texas A&M completely obliterated by some of the foes in the SEC Western Division, most notably Alabama 59-0, also Mississippi State and Ole Miss. So they get trounced by the big heavyweights in the division. We thought the same would happen at Auburn. And despite Auburn giving the ball away twice in the fourth quarter when they were going in for touchdowns, nobody thought Texas A&M would lead this game late in the game. They hang on for the victory. So Texas A&M in decent shape now for a solid bowl showing at 7-3. Missouri 4-1 leads the SEC East, and despite all that power in the West, Mizzou is lined up if they can hold serve to go to the championship game and possibly pull off the stunner of the year in defeating the West. So we got Mizzou with a huge game going to Kyle Field to take on the Aggies.
Well, this is a rivalry game. These two teams entered the SEC at the same time, so this is a rivalry game between them. Both of these teams have played these games very, very tough. You look at Missouri overall, have a little bit of problems in their secondary with a suspension, so I think that'll hurt Missouri in this ball game on the road in Kyle Field. If they were at home, it might be a little bit of a different story, but it's from the offensive perspective that I'm not sold on Missouri and Matty Mock. Very pedestrian this year. They usually have a very high-octane offense that can move the ball up-tempo. Haven't been the same type of offense under Matty Mock in his sophomore season that they were last year with James Franklin and Matty Mock at the helm. So not sold offensively on Missouri at this point. When you look at Texas A&M playing very well last week on the road in the Plains in Auburn, to be able to create 3 turnovers and win that turnover battle and really clamp down Auburn when the game was on the line. I was very impressed with Kevin Sumlin's crew, and Kyle Allen looked very impressive in the first half. He struggled a little bit in the second half as Auburn made the run, but had a very consistent first half. He looked in rhythm and got in tempo for that offense, and I think that's the difference. If this game was played in Columbia, I'd lean a little to the Missouri Tigers, but I think Kyle Field's a very difficult place to play. I expect the fan base to beat up after their upset victory over Auburn, and I think defensively, I like Texas A&M a little bit better at home on the defensive line right now, and I think they are able to create turnovers and get the victory over Missouri this weekend.
So we move from the old Big 12 rivalry to the South's oldest rivalry, Auburn-Georgia. 1 week ago, we were looking at the Tigers as possibly the best team in college football. They tumble all the way to number 9 after losing the game, the shocker, against the Aggies. They're at 7-2. Georgia at 7-2, but a different narrative for the Bulldogs is they just need one Mizzou slip-up to take advantage and jump back into a first-place tie and win that tiebreaker due to that 34-0 shellacking in Columbia against the Mizzou Tigers. Georgia hosting Auburn.
Well, Todd Gurley is listed as number 1 on the depth chart, so that's a benefit to the Georgia Bulldogs. But I think more of a benefit to the offense for Georgia was the fact that Hudson Mason broke out last week with a 4-touchdown pass performance on the road in Lexington. They utilized their weapons of Chris Conley, Malcolm Mitchell, and Blazevich, the tight end, and you saw the offensive running backs that they have. Sony Michel, Nick Chubb, and Gurley are all going to get carries in this ball game. Expect fresh legs in the ball game against Auburn at all times. And you look at the flip side for Auburn. I mentioned it on Monday's show, the fact that Williams, their big play wide receiver, is not going to be suited up for this ball game due to an MCL sprain. I think that's a big detriment for Auburn because of the fact that Georgia, from a defensive perspective, will be able to double-team Sammy Coates. When you look at what they were able to do, Auburn, when they had Williams and Coates in the ball game at both times, defenses can only double-team one of those guys, and that would open up play action for either Williams or Coates for the deep ball. You saw against Ole Miss in Oxford 2 weeks ago, Nick Marshall stretching the Ole Miss secondary. He's not going to be able to do that without Williams in the ball game. I think that's a benefit for Georgia. Their defense is creating turnovers. They're still plus 13 in turnover margin, and they're very solid in the secondary, led by Damian Swan. That secondary is only given up about 186 passing yards per game, and they're very solid at home in run support. So I think that the advantage in this game really favors Georgia, and I think Georgia, sensing that they have an opportunity to win the SEC East, should they win out, the today, this weekend, is up and focused for this ball game. I think this game is a blowout, Mark. I really think this game is about a 15 to 17-point margin for Georgia from an offensive perspective. I think if Georgia can open up the game, play action, and open up the vertical passing game, I think they can dominate Auburn just for the fact of a emotional loss at home to Texas A&M. How are they going to respond? No Williams in the lineup for the Tigers. I think that's a detriment, and I think Georgia, with the return of Gurley, dominates this ball game.
And finally, the game with huge ramifications, 1 versus 3, or if you think about it, maybe not so huge ramifications. If Alabama wins a very close game against Mississippi State, both teams could still be in play. MSU with 1 loss could still stay in the top 4. That would vault Alabama with a victory over the #1 team in college football, obviously even higher. So we will wait and see how the committee interprets a victory, especially by Alabama, in this situation. For Mississippi State, they're 8-0. They are the Auburn of this year. They have vaulted onto the scene. They go to Tuscaloosa to take on the Tide, who benefited from a number of gifts from LSU in the final minute to pull that game into overtime and then pull it out with a field goal. So we've got, or with a touchdown to DeAndrew White. Alabama hosting #1 Mississippi State.
Well, numbers-wise, Alabama's won 6 straight by 22 points per game, so that really favors the Alabama Crimson Tide into this matchup. Everybody's going to ask, how will Mississippi State respond on the road in Tuscaloosa? If you're asking me, I think they have to jump up early to take the crowd out of the ball game. But when you look at this matchup deeper, let's look at Mississippi State. They're averaging 264 passing yards per game. They're rushing for 254 rushing yards per game. They're balanced, and they have a very solid offense and defensive lines. When you look at the defense for Alabama, a couple things stand out for me. Only giving up 89 rushing yards per game, but the last 2 games against Tennessee and LSU, last week they gave up 183 rushing yards per game, and on the road in Knoxville they gave up 181 rushing yards per game. But they struggled in the second half against Joshua Dobbs and the Tennessee offense. Joshua Dobbs was able, in my opinion, to create some problems for the Alabama defense. He's a mobile quarterback, but he's not as mobile and agile as Dak Prescott. Dak Prescott's a more polished quarterback, can make plays if he breaks contain. I think this is a tough matchup for Alabama defensively because of what Dak Prescott presents from an offensive perspective. If he can break contain and tuck it and run, I think it could be a long day for Alabama. In order to beat Mississippi State, you have to challenge their secondary. Their secondary is giving up 300 passing yards per game. Blake Sims, Amari Cooper looked a little shaky on the road last week. I know that was against LSU, but still, 20 of 45, not as consistent as Nick Saban would want that offense. They came on in the overtime period, but I really think that if Mississippi State can jump up early and can rush the football with Josh Robinson, could be a long day for Alabama. I think it's a very close ball game, but I think Mississippi State gets the 3-point victory on the road in Tuscaloosa. I really think Mississippi State is legit.
They're legit along the offensive and defensive fronts, and that defensive front 7, the secondary, the whole defense is very, very strong. I really love what they've done in Starkville under Dan Mullen. The scenarios are many. There's no way to break them down. It's interesting to see what happens in the SEC West. Can 2 teams come out of there? Will the East upset the West? And how does that play in with Ohio State and the Big 12, TCU and Baylor? How does Baylor get judged against TCU? They've already played head-to-head, but the Horned Frogs are judged to be the better football team despite the loss. And the ramifications and the puzzle continues to become more and more intriguing or frustrating depending on your fan base. So, Joe, we appreciate the time. Joe Lisi of GoForThe2.com joining us every week for his top 25 predictions. So we appreciate it, Joe.
Thanks, Mark. Anytime. Love the show. Can't wait till the weekend to see how these games play out. It's awesome.